The day was dying over the Texas Panhandle, bleeding gold and crimson across the high, flat shoulders of the painted mesa. It was a heat you could wear, a physical weight that pressed down on the land, shimmering above the baked earth and drawing the last moisture from the brittle blades of grama grass. The wind, when it came, offered no relief. It was a hot breath that scoured the land, carrying the scent of dust, dry weeds, and the distant, metallic tang of thunder that had been threatening for hours but refused to break. This was the raw edge of 1886, a place where the sky was everything and the land was a stubborn prayer. Down at Brimstone Ferry, the world shrank to the width of the muddy river and the length of the dusty landing. Here, civilization was a raw, splintered thing, a general store with a sagging porch, a blacksmith's forge that rang with a weary rhythm, and the ferry itself, a squat barge pulled across the slow-moving water by a system of ropes and groaning pulleys. For Harlan Quaid, this was the end of the line. At 36, his life was a study in solitude, a collection of quiet rituals performed on the isolated stretch of land he called Raven Hollow. Bringing his salted hides and surplus grain to the ferry was one such ritual, a necessary intrusion of noise and people into a life he preferred to keep silent. He stood beside his horse, a powerful roan gelding named Ash Plume, and watched the ferryman tally the load. Harlan was a man carved from the same hard materials as the land itself. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long hours of labor performed alone. His face, weathered by sun and wind, was a landscape of quiet severity, dominated by eyes the color of a winter sky, eyes that watched more than they spoke. His duster was worn to the softness of felt at the cuffs and collar. The dark canvas faded to a dusty brown, a testament to years of service. The ferry bell clanged, a sharp, insistent sound that cut through the low murmur of the half-dozen other souls waiting at the landing. The metallic scrape of a horseshoe on stone, the creak of wagon wheels, the lowing of cattle penned nearby, it was the familiar, grating symphony of commerce. Harlan endured it. He took the offered script, folded it once, and tucked it into his vest pocket without a word. His business was done. It was then that the rhythm of the afternoon shattered. The thunder of hoofbeats and the rattle of wheels announced the arrival of the Wells Fargo stagecoach, coming in too fast. Pulled by a team of lathered horses, it skidded to a halt in a cloud of red dust, the driver sawing at the reins and shouting curses. Before the dust had even begun to settle, the coach door flew open and a figure burst out, a man, slight of build, with a bandana pulled high over his face. He clutched a leather satchel to his chest and ran, not towards the town, but towards the warren of warehouses and alleys that lined the riverbank. Chaos erupted. A woman screamed. A man shouted. "Stop him, the stagecoach guard!" A portly man with a face like a boiled ham fumbled for his shotgun, belatedly firing a shot into the air that sent a flock of pigeons scattering into the vast, indifferent sky. The small crowd surged, a confused and agitated mass, some driven by curiosity, others by a vague sense of civic duty. They moved as one, a clumsy, shuffling beast chasing the shadow of the thief. Harlan's first instinct, honed by years of avoiding other men's troubles, was to move away. He took Ash Plume's reins, his hand a calming pressure on the horse's neck, and began to lead him around the edge of the turmoil. He kept his head down, his focus on the space between his feet and the horse's hooves, navigating a clear path through the mess. He was almost past the largest of the warehouses when a flicker of movement in the deep shadows of its open doorway caught his eye. He stopped. It was a woman, or rather, a girl, who looked to be barely out of her teens. She was thin, almost wraith-like in the gloom, dressed in a simple, dark dress that had seen better days. A drab, gray canvas satchel was slung over one shoulder, held tight by a pale, slender hand. She had been pressed flat against a stack of feed sacks, trying to make herself invisible, and had nearly succeeded. But as the mob of townsfolk blundered past the doorway, She had shifted, and for a heartbeat, her face was caught in a stray shaft of amber light. It was her eyes that held him. They were wide and dark, but they held none of the fear or panic he would have expected. There was no plea for help, no damsel's terror. Instead, he saw a stark, unnerving self-possession. It was the gaze of a hawk, alert, wary, and utterly focused. In that brief, silent exchange, Harlan felt as if she had seen right through him, past the weathered face and the worn duster, and had taken the measure of the quiet, empty spaces inside him. The moment was broken by the grating voice of Marshal Deke Rowley, a man whose polished boots and silver star did little to conceal the soul of a vulture. He hadn't joined the chase, but stood near the stagecoach, his small, shrewd eyes scanning the chaos, not for justice, but for opportunity. He wasn't alone, Rowley declared to the stagecoach driver, his voice carrying easily in a lull in the noise. Saw a slip of a girl with him back at the last stop, thin thing, carrying a gray bag. A ripple of whispers went through the part of the crowd that remained. That's right, I saw her. Looked like she was running from something. Then, a man with a drooping mustache and a stained shirt spoke louder than the rest, his voice thick with the certainty of gossip. Heard tell she's the one. Carried off the Blackthorn Co-op's ledgers. Got all of Abram Pike's dealings in it. The name Abram Pike fell into the humid air with the weight of a stone. Pike was a man who cast a long and chilling shadow over the county. A land baron whose Blackthorn syndicate acquired property with the relentless efficiency of a plague. To be caught with his private ledgers was not a simple matter of theft. It was a death sentence. Harlan's gaze snapped back to the warehouse doorway. The shadows were empty. She was gone. He felt a strange lurch in his chest, a mixture of relief and an emotion he couldn't name. He had turned to leave, to put the whole sordid affair behind him, when a hand touched his arm. It was her. She had materialized from the space between two large flour barrels, moving with a silence that was deeply unsettling. Her face was pale in the fading light, her lips pressed into a thin, determined line. She looked up at him, and again he was struck by the intensity of her gaze. It was not a look that asked for anything, but one that seemed to issue a challenge. Without a word, she reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was creased and grimy. She took his hand, a hand calloused and scarred from decades of ranch work, and turned it palm up. Her fingers were cold, but her touch was firm, insistent. She pressed the paper into his palm, her dark eyes never leaving his. A silent command to take it, to keep it. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, she slipped away, melting back into the labyrinth of crates and barrels, becoming one with the shadows. Harlan stood frozen for a long moment, the warmth of her touch lingering on his skin. He could hear Marshal Rowley organizing a search, his voice full of self-important bluster. Check the warehouses, every nook and cranny. $100 for the man who finds her. Slowly, Harlan closed his fingers around the paper. It felt fragile, insignificant. He risked a glance at it, unfolding it in the cup of his hand. It wasn't a letter. It was a rough sketch, drawn in pencil, of what looked like a surveyor's stake next to a distinctive rock formation. Below the drawing, a few words were scrawled in a neat, concise hand. Blackthorn Co-op false stake. He was a man who drew clear, hard lines around his life. On one side was Raven Hollow, his land, his horse, his work. On the other side was everything else: the noise, the greed, the endless, messy complications of other people. He had no place for false stakes and stolen ledgers. His first thought was to drop the paper, to let it become part of the dust and grime of the ferry landing, to erase the moment and the girl from his memory. But he couldn't. He couldn't shake the image of her eyes, that unnerving calm, that refusal to be a victim. It had struck a chord deep within him, a resonance with the profound and abiding loneliness that was the very foundation of his existence. In her stillness, he had recognized a sliver of his own. The first drops of rain began to fall. Not the violent deluge the thunder had promised, but a soft, persistent mizzle that turned the red dust to a dark, slick mud. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of wet earth and creosote. The crowd began to disperse, grumbling about the rain and the failed excitement. Marshal Rowley's search seemed to be losing its momentum, swallowed by the growing dusk. Harlan folded the paper carefully and slid it into the inner pocket of his duster. He led Ash Plume away from the landing, his boots making soft, sucking sounds in the mud. He swung himself up into the saddle, the familiar creak of leather a small comfort in a world that had suddenly become unsettled. He turned his horse towards the long, empty trail that led to Raven Hollow. As he rode, the fine rain slicking his duster and beating on the brim of his hat, he could feel the small square of paper against his chest. It was a fragile, weightless thing, yet it felt heavier than iron, a promise or a sentence, and his heart hammered a rhythm against his ribs that was no longer entirely his own. The ride back to Raven Hollow was long, the mizzle turning the trail into a slick ribbon of red clay. Harlan kept Ash Plume to a steady walk, the horse's familiarity with the path a comfort in the encroaching darkness. The piece of paper in his duster pocket felt alive, a restless, foreign object against his ribs. He was a man who understood the language of the land, of weather, of animal tracks. He did not understand the language of frightened women, stolen ledgers, and false stakes. Raven Hollow was his sanctuary precisely because it was empty of such things. His ranch was nestled in a shallow basin, sheltered from the worst of the wind by a crescent of low, rocky hills. It wasn't much a sturdy two-room cabin built of cottonwood logs chinked with mud, a barn that was stronger than the house, and a web of corrals. It was a place of function, not comfort, scrubbed clean by the wind and Harlan's own austere habits. He unsaddled Ash Plume in the dark, the familiar movements automatic. He was rubbing the horse down when the gelding suddenly lifted his head, ears swiveling towards the back of the barn, and let out a low, questioning nicker. Harlan froze. He was not alone. His hand went to the hunting knife on his belt. He moved without a sound, his boots silent in the dirt floor. He grabbed the lantern from its hook, struck a match against the stone wall, and lifted the light. She was huddled in the farthest stall, half buried in a pile of clean hay meant for winter feed. She looked even smaller than she had at the ferry, her knees drawn to her chest, the gray satchel clutched in her lap like a shield. In the lantern's glow, her face was pale, streaked with mud and exhaustion, but her eyes were the same. They were not the eyes of a cornered animal. They were the eyes of a sentry, watchful and weighing him. He held the lantern steady. He had a dozen questions, starting with how she had possibly gotten here. She must have run, cutting across miles of open prairie in the rain, following the vague direction of his departure until she saw the smudge of his chimney smoke. It was a feat of endurance that bordered on the impossible. He said nothing. He was not a man given to easy speech, and he sensed that words were the wrong currency here. He looked at her, and she looked at him. The silence in the barn was thick, broken only by the nervous shuffle of the horse and the steady drumming of the rain on the shingle roof. Finally, Mara shifted. She kept one hand on her satchel and, with the other, reached for a piece of charcoal from a long-dead fire pit Harlan used for branding. She turned to the cleaned planed wood of the stall's dividing beam. Her hand was shaking, but the letters she formed were deliberate. "Please, one night, gone morning." Harlan read the words. He looked at her drenched dress, the mud caked on her worn-out shoes, the way she shivered despite her attempt to control it. He thought of Marshal Rowley's hunt. He thought of Abram Pike's reputation, a man who crushed obstacles without a second thought. To turn her out now, in the dark, in the rain, was to feed her to the wolves. He also thought of his solitude. He thought of the quiet order of his days, an order she had already shattered. He gave a single, curt nod. He left the barn, walked to the cabin, and returned minutes later. He didn't enter the stall. He set two things down on the packed earth just outside it, a tin bowl of the venison stew he had cooked for himself, still warm from the stove, and a heavy, folded wool blanket. She watched him, her expression unreadable. He took the lantern and hung it on its hook near the barn door, leaving the interior in deep, protective shadows. Then he walked back to the cabin, leaving the main barn door open just a crack. He sat on his porch, in his usual chair, rolling a cigarette he didn't light. He listened to the rain on the tin roof, a sound that usually calmed him. Tonight, it felt like a countdown. He watched the barn, a dark shape against the darker hills, and waited for the long night to end. He must have drifted off, because the next thing he knew, the rain had stopped and a pale, gray light was creeping over the eastern mesa. His neck was stiff. He stood, stretched, and looked towards the barn. He expected to find it empty, the bowl and blanket left behind. The girl vanished like a phantom. Instead, he heard a sound, a steady, rhythmic scrape. He walked to the barn. The blanket was folded neatly where he had left it. The stew bowl was empty, wiped clean with hay, and Mara Lark was at the water trough, using a stiff brush to scrub the algae from the wooden basin. She had found his spare set of canvas work gloves, and they were ridiculously large on her, but she worked with a fierce, practiced efficiency. Her hair was pulled back, tied with a scrap of twine. Her movements were quick, economical. She was working as if paying a debt. When she saw him, she didn't stop, but she did pause, looking at him as if awaiting a verdict. He saw that the broken harness strap he'd left hanging on a peg was no longer broken. The leather had been neatly stitched, the thread dark and strong. He nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, and went to the cabin to make coffee. She followed him a few minutes later, standing hesitantly at the open kitchen door. The cabin was one large room, with his bed in one corner, a stone fireplace, and a kitchen table. She remained on the threshold, poised to flee. Harlan poured coffee into a tin mug and pushed it across the table toward her. She looked at it, then at him, and finally stepped inside, her bare feet silent on the plank floor. She had taken off her ruined shoes. On the wall next to the stove, Harlan kept a small slate chalkboard for tracking feed supplies and lists for town. He picked up the nub of chalk. He wrote a single word and tapped the slate. Name. She took the chalk. Her handwriting was much clearer than the desperate scrawl in the barn. Mara Lark. Beneath the name, she drew a small, simple sketch, two stylized wings, side by side, like those of a lark in flight. He studied the drawing for a moment, then erased the slate. He took the crumpled paper from his duster, the one from the ferry, and smoothed it on the table. He turned to the largest wall in the cabin, which was dominated by a huge, hand-drawn map of the county, marked with his own notes on grazing land, water sources, and property lines. He found the rock formation from the sketch, a distinctive cluster known as the Sisters. He placed the small paper against the map. It fit perfectly. The false stake was marked on a section of land called Dry Needle Draw. A cold knot tightened in Harlan's gut. Dry Needle Draw was not just some random parcel. It was the arid, rocky tract that separated his own land, Raven Hollow, from the sprawling, ever-expanding empire of the Blackthorn Co-op. For 2 years, that boundary had been a point of contention, a dispute that consisted of Pike's men pushing the line and Harlan quietly pushing it back. The whispers from the ferry landing now made a terrible kind of sense. Heard tell she's the one, carried off the Blackthorn Co-op's ledgers. The rumors about Abram Pike had been circulating for months, quiet and fearful. Stories of ranchers finding their property deeds suddenly invalid, of signatures appearing on documents they'd never seen, of the county clerk mysteriously losing old records just before Blackthorn filed a new claim. Pike wasn't just buying land, he was consuming it, using a blizzard of paperwork and leveraged debt to do what cattle barons of old had done with fences and bullets. This girl, Mara Lark, hadn't just stolen a book. She had stolen the weapon. A shadow fell across the open doorway. Morning, Quaid. Harlan didn't jump, but the muscles in his back went rigid. He turned slowly. Mara had flattened herself against the wall near the pantry, invisible from the outside. Marshal Deke Rowley was sitting casually on his horse. A big bay, his posture relaxed. But nothing about Rowley was ever relaxed. His smile was a thin, dry crease in his face, and his eyes, cold as river stones, missed nothing. "Marshal," Harlan said. His voice was a low rasp. "Nasty bit of business down at the ferry yesterday," Rowley said, seemingly just making conversation. He produced a tobacco plug and bit off a corner. "Shame about that Wells Fargo box, but more's the point. We're still looking for that accomplice. A young woman. Skinny thing." Harlan leaned against the doorframe, projecting an air of tired indifference. "Wasn't my business. Marshal, I dropped my hides and left." "So I heard," Rowley said, his gaze drifting past Harlan, scanning the interior of the cabin. You left in a hurry, right as the rain started. Funny thing is, a man back at the landing said he saw you talking to someone, right by the warehouses." "Talking to my horse. He doesn't like crowds," Harlan said flatly. Rowley chuckled, a dry, clicking sound. "Your horse, right. Thing is, Quaid, you're a man who keeps to himself. A man like that. He notices when something's out of place. You see a stranger, especially a stranger in that much trouble you'd remember." The marshal's eyes dropped from Harlan's face down to the ground. Harlan followed his gaze. Ash Plume, tethered to the hitching post, was stamping impatiently, and caked on his hooves, distinct against the dark, loamy soil of the hollow, was the unmistakable red-orange, silty mud of the Brimstone Ferry landing. It was different from the soil up here. It was a bright, telltale stain. Rowley's eyes lifted back to Harlan's, and the thin smile widened. Just a fraction. He knew, or at least, he knew enough to be certain. "Well," Rowley said, gathering his reins. "Just doing my rounds. Abram Pike is very interested in recovering his lost property. He's offering a substantial reward for any information." "Substantial." He tipped his hat. "You see anything? Quaid, you let me know." He turned his horse and rode out of the hollow, not once looking back. The silence he left behind was heavier, more dangerous, than the one he had interrupted. Harlan turned back into the cabin. Mara emerged from the shadows, her face bloodless. She walked to the slate, her movements jerky, and wrote, "He knows. I go." She looked at him, her eyes wide with a new emotion, not fear for herself, but a kind of dreadful apology. She was trouble, and she knew it, and she was releasing him from it. She made a sharp, cutting gesture with her hand toward the door. "Go!" Harlan stood there, caught in the cross-currents of his life. The solitude he had cultivated for a decade felt, for the first time, not like peace, but like a brittle, hollow shell. Rowley's veiled threat, the casual way he'd implied Pike's power, had lit a slow, cold fire in Harlan's stomach. And then there was the map, the false stake at Dry Needle Draw. That wasn't just her problem anymore. That was his boundary. That was his land they were nibbling at. He looked at Mara. She wasn't a girl. She was a fighter. She had run miles in the dark. She had worked for her keep before the sun was up. And now she was ready to walk back into the storm to protect him. That quiet, hawk-like resolve he'd seen at the ferry. It wasn't a fluke. It was the core of her. He took the chalk from her hand. His own movements were slow, deliberate. He erased her words and wrote his own, pressing the chalk so hard it nearly snapped. It was not an offer. It was a decree. Work. He tapped the word. Stay. He tapped it again. Silent safety. He looked her in the eye. He was offering a trade. Her labor for his protection. Her silence for his. It was a bargain struck in the harsh language of the prairie. A contract of mutual necessity. Mara Lark stared at the words for a long time. Her breathing was shallow. He could see the pulse beating in her throat, slowly, as if lifting a great weight. She reached out and put her small, calloused hand on the slate, just below his words. She nodded. Once. Their bargain was sealed not with a handshake, but with the quiet scrape of chalk on slate. The days that followed settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the ranch. A new kind of silence fell over Raven Hollow, different from the stark emptiness Harlan was used to. It was a shared silence, a space filled with the presence of another person, and it was, to Harlan's surprise, more comfortable than the solitude he had so fiercely guarded. The sun was barely a suggestion in the east when Mara would rise. Harlan, a lifelong early riser himself, would wake to find her already moving. She would stand by the cabin's small window, a dark silhouette against the pearly light, tying her long, dark hair back with a piece of twine. It was a simple, functional act, but she did it with a focused grace that transformed it into a small ritual, a gathering of strength for the day ahead. Her hands told a story of a life that had not prepared her for this one. They were slender, with long fingers made for the delicate work of pen and ink, not post-hole diggers and leather straps. In a matter of days, the soft skin was red, then blistered, then calloused. She never complained. Harlan would leave a tin of tallow salve on the porch rail, and in the morning, it would have been moved, a small, silent acknowledgement of his gesture. She worked with a relentless, quiet determination. He found her one morning reinforcing a section of the corral fence, her small frame straining to tighten the wire. She had watched him do it once and had absorbed the mechanics of the task perfectly. She seemed to learn by watching, by absorbing the physical language of the work. Another day. He came back from checking the far pastures to find small bundles of herbs, yarrow, sage, and something he didn't recognize hanging from the rafters of the porch to dry. They filled the air with a clean, sharp scent that mingled with the smell of pine and dust. It was another small, silent imposition on his world, and yet it felt less like an invasion and more like an improvement. Words were a useless currency between them. They built a new language instead, one of gestures and shared tasks. He taught her the simple hand signals he used when working cattle alone. A closed fist meant stop. A hand slicing through the air meant danger. A hand cupped and brought to the mouth meant water. He showed her how to read the clouds for rain and the dust devils for wind. In return, she taught him to see his own land with new eyes. He knew the broad strokes of his property, the flow of the creek, the best grazing spots. She taught him the fine print, one afternoon, while they were clearing rocks from a new patch of ground. She stopped and pointed. She didn't speak, but used a stick to draw in the dirt. She showed him how the moss grew thicker on the north side of the largest boulders. A natural compass. She pointed out a yucca plant, its roots exposed by erosion, and showed him how its deep, tenacious grip on the earth meant the soil beneath was stable, not prone to washing out. She was teaching him to read the land's own ledger, a language of stone and root that predated any deed or surveyor's stake. His horse, Ash Plume, remained a stubborn holdout. The roan was a one-man animal, wary and resentful of any new presence. He would shy away from Mara, pinning his ears back if she came too close to his stall. Harlan expected her to be afraid of the powerful, ill-tempered animal. Instead, she was patient. She would stand near the corral, not looking directly at the horse, and simply wait. One evening, as Harlan was brushing him down, Mara approached slowly. She held out a hand, not to pet him, but simply to offer her scent. The horse snorted, stamping a hoof, but he didn't back away. Mara then did something Harlan had never seen before. She reached out, very slowly, and laid her open palm flat against the horse's massive, warm neck. She didn't stroke or pat, she just held it there. She closed her eyes, and Harlan could see her consciously slowing her breathing, her small shoulders rising and falling in a deep, steady rhythm. Ash Plume's muscles were tense, his skin twitching. But as she stood there, a silent statue of calm, the horse gradually relaxed, his head lowered. The tension went out of his powerful frame. He leaned into her hand, just slightly, and let out a long, soft sigh. It was a surrender, a moment of trust granted, and Harlan felt an answering quietness settle in his own chest. Their days were measured by work, their evenings by the fire. They ate simple meals: bean stew, fresh baked bread, coffee at the small kitchen table. The large, hand-drawn map on the wall was a constant presence, a silent third party in their shared space. During one lunch, Harlan watched as Mara looked up from her bowl. Her eyes went to the map, to the section marked Dry Needle Draw. She reached out, her finger tracing the penciled line he had drawn to mark the location of the false stake. Her touch was feather-light, reverent, as if she were not touching paper, but the living skin of the earth itself, listening for a truth that had been deliberately silenced. The first true shift between them came as unexpectedly as a summer storm. They were working outside the barn as dusk settled, securing a loose section of the roof before the rain that the wind promised. She was standing on the lowest crossbeam of the corral fence to get a better angle, hammering a nail into place. The wood was damp from the earlier mizzle, and her foot slipped. It was a small thing, a loss of balance for a fraction of a second. But Harlan was standing just behind her, passing up shingles. Instinct took over. He didn't think, he moved. His hand shot out, his arm circling her waist to steady her. He felt the slimness of her, the surprising strength in her small frame, the way she gasped and pressed back against his chest for a moment of solid grounding. The danger was over in a heartbeat. He could have let go, he should have let go, but for a long second, he didn't. His hand remained at her waist. She was still, her shoulder pressed against his. She turned her head, her face just inches from his. He could feel the warmth of her breath on his cheek, could smell the scent of rain in her hair. Her eyes, wide and dark in the twilight, were full of a startled, questioning vulnerability he had never seen before. He saw the flicker of fear, not of him, but of the moment itself, and it broke the spell. He immediately took a half step back, releasing her, putting a respectful distance between them. It felt like a retreat. "Careful," he managed, his voice rougher than he intended. She simply nodded, turning back to her work, but the air had changed. The space between them was no longer empty. It was charged, filled with the unspoken acknowledgement of what had just passed. He found his gaze lingering not on her face, but on the tiny, glistening beads of moisture clinging to her dark eyelashes. Each one a perfect, fragile world. He knew he had to teach her to ride. If she had to flee, it would be on horseback or not at all. The next afternoon, he led Ash Plume out, now tolerant if not enthusiastic about her presence. "You'll need to know this," he said, the words feeling clumsy in the quiet air. He showed her how to approach the horse, how to hold the reins. Then came the moment of mounting. He put his hands on her waist, preparing to lift her. She was impossibly light. He swung her up, and she landed awkwardly in the heavy leather saddle. "No, like this," he said, moving closer. He stood beside her, his arm coming around her back to guide her. His hand rested on her far side, his forearm pressing gently against the small of her back. "Sit straight, heels down." His other hand adjusted her grip on the reins. He was close enough to feel the warmth of her through her thin dress, to see the pulse beating in her neck. It was an instruction, a lesson, but it felt like something far more intimate. This was the quiet world he understood, the hush of the saddle, the language of leather and horseflesh, and he had just invited her into it. He swung up behind her, settling into the space at the back of the saddle. He took the reins. "Just feel the rhythm," he murmured, his voice low, close to her ear. He nudged Ash Plume into a slow, deliberate walk. At first, she was rigid, holding herself away from him, but as the horse moved, its powerful shoulders rocking in a steady, calming cadence, She slowly relaxed. She let her back rest against his chest, her head just below his chin. He could feel the slight weight of her, the rise and fall of her breathing as it began to sync with his own. They rode a long circuit around the hollow, not speaking. The only sounds were the creak of the saddle leather, the horse's soft footfalls, and their two synchronized breaths. In that shared rhythm, surrounded by the vast, empty land, the knot of tension in Harlan's chest, a knot he had carried for years, began to loosen. That night, the air was cool and clear. They sat by the fire outside the cabin, the slate and chalk between them. He had 1,000 questions for her. Questions about her life, about the ledgers, about what had driven her to such a desperate act. But he didn't know how to ask them. Instead, he wrote something else, a question that had been forming in his mind for days. "Where do you listen from?" He tapped the slate. Looking at her, he meant, how did she know about the yucca roots, about the horse's temper, about the coming rain? How did she perceive the world with such quiet intensity? She looked at the question for a long time, the firelight flickering in her dark eyes. She didn't pick up the chalk. Instead, she lifted her hand and pressed her palm flat against her own chest, over her heart. She looked at him, her expression open and serious. Here. It was the most honest and the most profound answer she could have given. Later that night, long after she had retired to her pallet of blankets in the cabin's second, smaller room, Harlan sat alone at the kitchen table. He took out the crumpled piece of paper she had given him. He smoothed it one last time, looking at the sketch of the false stake, the words that had thrown his life into chaos. He then retrieved an old, empty tobacco tin from a shelf. It was a worthless object, but it was his. He carefully folded the paper and placed it inside, pressing the lid down firmly. He walked to the far corner of the cabin, prized up a loose floorboard, and wedged the tin into the dark, earthy space beneath. As the wood settled back into place, he felt a decision solidify within him, hard and irrevocable as stone. This was no longer just about giving a stranger shelter for a night. The paper was buried in the foundation of his home. Her secret was now his. His silent vow was twofold: he would protect her, and by doing so, he would protect the truth the paper represented. Just as he was about to blow out the lantern, a faint sound drifted on the night wind from the direction of town, miles away. It was the sound of the evening church bell, a lonely, resonant peal calling the faithful to prayer. Through the window, he could see Mara standing in the doorway of her room, looking out into the darkness. She was staring towards the distant, invisible town, towards the place where a small wooden cross stood silhouetted against the sky. Her hands, which had been hanging loosely at her sides, slowly clenched into fists. The peace of their shared silence was over. The world was coming for them. The church bell had been a distant, mournful sound the night before. By Sunday morning, it was an instrument of judgment. Abram Pike was dead, but his widow, Temperance, was very much alive, and in many ways, more dangerous. Where her husband had been a blunt instrument of greed, Temperance was a stiletto, sharp, slender, and wielded with precision. She arrived at the morning service dressed in immaculate black silk, a grieving relict whose sorrow was as elegant and weaponized as her posture. She did not speak from the pulpit. She had no need, in the quiet moments after the sermon, as the congregation shuffled out into the unforgiving sunlight. She worked the crowd with the skill of a master politician. She would lay a gloved hand on a woman's arm, her voice a conspiratorial whisper, a shared burden of Christian concern. "It is a terrible thing, Martha, when a good man's work is undone by wickedness," she would murmur, her eyes brimming with a carefully measured sadness. That poor girl, so lost, to be led astray, to steal the very ledgers that record the co-op's charitable funds. It breaks the heart. The poison spread with astonishing speed. The story was simple, tragic, and easy to believe. A runaway girl, a thief, had taken advantage of a grieving widow. The missing ledgers were not tools of a land grab, but the sacred accounts of the church's own charity fund, administered by the benevolent Blackthorn Co-op. By noon, Mara Lark was no longer an accomplice to a stagecoach robber. She was a Judas in a calico dress, a serpent who had stolen from God himself, and, by extension, any man who sheltered such a creature was a sinner in his own right. The community's verdict was delivered by fire. Late Tuesday night, a hellish orange glow bloomed against the dark belly of the clouds to the west. Harlan saw it from his porch. It was too bright, too hungry to be a brush fire. It was a structure. It was the town. He saddled Ash Plume in minutes, his movements clipped and efficient. He didn't know why he was going. It wasn't his town, but the fire felt like a message, and he had a cold, sick feeling he was the intended recipient. It was Cooper's Mill, the largest grain storehouse in the county, a symbol of the town's collective harvest and hope. By the time Harlan arrived, it was a roaring inferno, a monstrous beast of flame that devoured the dry timber with a sound like a continuous clap of thunder. Sparks shot 100 feet into the air, a deadly, glittering rain. The heat was a physical blow, driving the bucket brigade back, their efforts pathetically small against the scale of the destruction. Marshal Deke Rowley was already there, not fighting the fire, but directing the narrative. His face was slick with sweat in the firelight, his eyes alight with a grim satisfaction. "It's the stranger," he shouted over the roar, to a group of exhausted, soot-stained men. "Had to be. Set this to distract us while she makes her escape a diversion. Plain and simple. Damned vagrants, bringing their trouble to our doorstep." He saw Harlan then, a tall, solitary figure on his roan at the edge of the chaos. Rowley's eyes narrowed. He walked over, leading his horse, his stride full of purpose. "Quaid," he said, his voice hard. "You live out that way. You see anyone on the trail tonight? A thin girl moving fast." "Just saw the fire," Harlan said, his voice flat, his gaze fixed on the collapsing roof of the mill. "A fire that benefits no one but a fugitive." Rowley pressed. "Someone trying to muddy the waters, to make us forget about the good work of the Blackthorn Co-op, about the funds that were stolen." Harlan said nothing. He dismounted, tied Ash Plume to a hitching post well away from the flames, and grabbed a bucket. He joined the line of men, passing the heavy, sloshing pails of water from the town well to the front. He worked in grim silence, his powerful shoulders and back moving with a steady, tireless rhythm. He was one of them, a man of the territory, fighting a common enemy, but he wasn't. He felt their eyes on him, the men he'd known for years, men with whom he'd traded goods and shared a terse nod at the ferry, now looked at him with a new expression. It was a mixture of suspicion and a kind of fearful resentment. His solitude, once accepted as a simple fact of his character, had been reframed. It was no longer the mark of a private man. It was the mark of a secretive one. Always kept to himself, that one. He heard a man mutter to another as they passed buckets. Never could figure him. Now maybe we know why. The AM light revealed a steaming, blackened ruin. The mill was gone. Harlan, his face and clothes streaked with ash, went to retrieve his horse. Jed Cooper, the mill's owner, a man whose face looked like a crumpled piece of parchment, stopped him. "Appreciate the help." "Harlan," Cooper said, but his voice was hollow, and his eyes wouldn't quite meet Harlan's. The words were a courtesy, but the gratitude was thin, stretched over a dark well of suspicion. The fire had burned more than just a building. It had burned the last of Harlan's anonymity. He rode home feeling like a marked man. The open prairie, usually a source of comfort, felt exposed, watched. As he approached the turnoff to Raven Hollow, he saw it, a piece of paper, folded and stuck onto one of his fence posts with the point of a skinning knife. He pulled the knife from the wood, his knuckles white. The blade was cold. He unfolded the note. The words were crudely formed, written in the same charcoal as the plea Mara had written on his barn wall. It was a deliberate, cruel mockery. "Give her up. Your land is safe." It was not a threat, it was a transaction. Her life for his. He crushed the paper in his fist, the cold fury he'd been suppressing since the fire finally solidifying into a hard, sharp-edged resolve. When he reached the cabin, Mara was standing on the porch, waiting. She must have seen the smoke, must have spent the night in a state of quiet terror. She looked at his ash-stained face, then at the crumpled paper in his hand. She didn't need to ask. She knew. She went to the slate and wrote, "They did it." Harlan nodded, his jaw tight. He smoothed the note on the table. "They want you." She looked at the cruel words, and, for the first time, he saw a flicker of true fear in her eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by that familiar, fierce concentration. She took the chalk and drew a small, swirling symbol on the slate. It looked like a whirlwind. Then she pointed to the west, where the mill had been, and then to the east, towards the Badlands. Harlan frowned, not understanding. She erased the drawing and sketched the mill, then drew a series of wavy lines moving away from it. "Wind," she wrote. She pointed at the lines, then at the symbol she had drawn before. Changed. He understood then. The wind on the night of the fire had been blowing from the south. A vagrant on foot, fleeing the scene, would have had the wind at their back, pushing them north or east. It would have been the logical direction of escape. She wasn't finished. She went to the cabin door and pointed to the ground outside. She drew a boot print in the dirt, then a deep, straight line beside it. She looked at him, her eyes intense. She pressed down on the drawing of the line, making it deeper, then made a gesture with her hands as if she were carrying something heavy. Harlan's mind, accustomed to the practical logic of the ranch, began to piece it together. A man on foot, running, leaves a jumble of prints, but a heavy wagon, a wagon with hard-rimmed wheels. Not a farmer's cart. It would leave deep, straight ruts, and if it was carrying something heavy, like barrels. He looked at her, a new appreciation dawning. She was telling him they'd left the wrong tracks. The arsonist, intending to frame a person on foot, had forgotten about the wind and the evidence of his own vehicle. He had created a trail, but it was a trail that pointed directly away from the intended suspect. "Pine resin," Harlan said, the words coming out in a low rasp. "It burns hot and fast. You'd need a wagon to haul it." Mara nodded, her expression grim. She pointed out into the darkness. "We find it." They waited until the moon was down. Harlan carried a rifle. Mara, a lantern with its light shuttered down to a mere slit. They rode Ash Plume, moving as a single shadow across the landscape. They didn't go to the mill. They circled wide, picking up the trail a half-mile east of the burned-out structure, exactly where Mara's logic of the wind had told him it would be. The tracks were faint, but they were there. 2 deep ruts, cutting a straight, determined path away from town, heading into the broken, rocky country near Salt Hook Wash. They followed for over an hour, the only sounds the horses' soft steps and the chirr of night insects. The trail ended abruptly at a dense thicket of mesquite and scrub oak at the edge of the wash. It was a place no one would go by accident. Harlan dismounted, handing the reins to Mara. He moved into the thicket, his senses on high alert. He found it almost immediately. A large canvas tarp, dark green and stamped with the familiar, stark black letters B. Blackthorn Co-op. It was thrown over a pile of something. Harlan lifted a corner of the heavy canvas. Underneath were 4 large barrels, smelling sharply of pine resin. 3 were empty. 1 was still half full. The arsonist had been in a hurry, dumping his tools before circling back to town. He heard a twig snap behind him. He spun around, dropping the tarp, the rifle coming up to his shoulder. It was Mara. She had followed him, moving as silently as a cat. She put a hand on his arm, a silent command to be still. She knelt beside the barrels, ignoring the sticky residue, and placed her palm flat against the side of the half-full one. Her eyes widened. She looked up at him and mouthed a single, silent word. Warm. They had just missed him. At that moment, they heard a low curse from the other side of the thicket, followed by the sound of a man relieving himself against the rocks. Their blood ran cold. They were frozen, trapped in the small clearing with the evidence of the crime, not 50 feet from one of the men who had committed it. Harlan could feel Mara's hand trembling on his arm, but she made no sound. They waited, every muscle tensed, listening to the man finish, kick a loose stone, and then move off, his footsteps fading into the night. They didn't breathe until the silence was absolute again. Harlan looked at the barrels, then at the tarp. They couldn't take the resin. It was too heavy, too clumsy. But the tarp was proof. It was Blackthorn property, found miles from where it should be, at the end of a trail leading from the fire. He folded the heavy, sticky canvas into a manageable bundle and tied it behind the saddle. The ride back was tense, every shadow a potential threat, every gust of wind the sound of approaching hoofbeats. They didn't speak when they reached the safety of the barn. Harlan untied the tarp and carried it inside. It smelled of resin and dust and deceit. He stood for a moment, looking at it. Then, with a sudden, decisive movement, he shook it open. He found a length of rope, threw it over one of the high rafters, and hoisted the tarp up until it hung like a captured flag. The black letters of the Blackthorn Co-op stark and accusatory in the lantern light. It was a trophy. It was a secret declaration of war. It was a promise. The next day, Harlan rode into town. He didn't bring the tarp. It was his word against theirs. And he knew how that would end. But the story of the tracks, of the resin, was something else. He found Rowley at the saloon, nursing a morning whiskey. Harlan laid it out for him. The simple facts, the wind, the direction of the tracks, the evidence of a heavy wagon. Rowley listened, a smirk playing on his lips. He took a long drink before answering. "Quaid, you've been spending too much time alone. Your mind is playing tricks on you. Tracks in the dark, the wind. That's not evidence. That's just junk a man finds in the dirt." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "Now, a stolen ledger. That's evidence. And harboring the thief who took it, that's a crime. You go back to your ranch and you think long and hard about that reward Abram Pike is offering. It's the only smart play you have left." Harlan looked into the marshal's dead eyes and saw the truth. The law was not blind in this county. It was bought and paid for. He turned and walked out of the saloon, the murmurs and suspicious stares of the townsfolk following him like a shroud. He was on his own. Or rather, the two of them were. Harlan Quaid was not a man who asked for help. Asking meant owing. Owing meant being tied to the very world he had spent a lifetime fencing out. But the fire at Cooper's Mill had burned that fence to the ground. Marshal Rowley's dismissive smirk had been the final confirmation the law was a locked door, and Abram Pike's widow held the only key. If he wanted to fight, he could not do it alone. He rode into town the next day. Not to the saloon or the general store, but to the one-room schoolhouse. He dismounted and stood for a full minute, hat in hand, listening to the drone of children reciting their letters. He waited until the bell rang and the children burst out, scattering like quail. Miss Ada Marin emerged last, brushing chalk dust from her gray skirt. She was a woman in her late 30s, plain as a pine board, but her eyes, behind small spectacles, were sharp and steady. They were eyes that believed in sums, in right and wrong answers. "Mr. Quaid," she said, her voice betraying a mild surprise. He was not a man who visited the schoolhouse. "Is there something I can do for you?" He felt clumsy, his large frame out of place on her small, orderly porch. "Miss Marin, I have a discrepancy with my land." She waited, her expression patient, professional. "My western boundary is at Dry Needle Draw," he said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "The stakes have been moved. The Blackthorn Co-op is claiming pasture that isn't theirs."
"That is a serious allegation. Mr. Quaid, surely the county assessor."
"The assessor," Harlan interrupted, then softened his tone. "The assessor relies on the filings. I believe the filings are wrong. I'm told you're the best head for numbers in this county, that you keep your own ledgers." Ada's gaze sharpened. This was not a plea for sympathy. It was an appeal to her intellect. The county archives are public, but they are also disorganized. What is it you truly want me to look for? I want to know if my deed is the only one that's shifted. I want to know if the numbers on Pike's maps match the numbers on the original surveys. He paused, then added, the one thing he knew would move her. I don't believe they're just moving stakes. Ma'am, I believe they're changing the math. Her eyes narrowed. To challenge the math was to challenge the very foundation of order. I will look, Mr. Quaid. I make no promises, but I will compare the ledgers. The truth of a sum doesn't change, no matter who writes it. Harlan nodded, a weight lifting from him. I'm obliged, ma'am. He left her and rode not home, but to the wagon camp at the edge of town, a collection of painted carts and lean-tos. He found the man he was looking for, a slight, dapper figure tuning a fiddle on his wagon's tailgate. Tobin Gray sold pianos, sheet music, and patent medicines, a profession that required a light touch and a keen ear. It was also a profession that rumor said gave him an uncanny skill with locks, tumblers, and any delicate mechanism. Quaid, Tobin said, his fingers dancing over the strings, you look like a man who's lost a fight with a chimney. Come to buy a harmonica, soothe that troubled soul. Harlan walked straight to the point. He gestured back toward the hollow. I have something at my barn. A tarp. Smells of pine resin. I need to know if it smells of anything else. Tobin's playful expression faded. He was a man who survived by reading the wind, and Harlan Quaid smelled like a storm. That's a strange request. It's a strange time. 10 minutes later, Tobin was in Harlan's barn, standing under the hanging blackthorn canvas. He ran his slender, sensitive fingers over the fabric, then brought them to his nose. He sniffed once, twice. Well, it's resin. All right, and creosote, and... He leaned closer, inhaling deeply, and a high-grade machine oil. Not axle grease, finer, like a gunsmith uses. Or he looked at Harlan, like what you'd use on the tumblers of a bank safe. A safe. Pike's office has one. A new model from St. Louis. I saw it delivered. Tobin said, his eyes bright with professional interest. This oil, it's the same. Someone got resin on their hands, then handled something oiled with this. Or the other way around. Either way, your firebug has expensive hobbies. He stepped back, a slow smile spreading. This is getting interesting. Quaid. Count me in. The final piece of his unwilling alliance was found 2 days later. Harlan rode to the high ridges, to the place where the prairie broke against the mesas, and found Rook Talon. Rook was Pawnee, a man who moved over the land as if he were part of it, reading stories in broken twigs and displaced stones that Harlan, for all his years, had never seen. He served as a guide for the Army Scouts when they needed one, and disappeared when they didn't. He trusted the earth, not the men who drew lines on it. Harlan brought him to Dry Needle Draw. He didn't show him the map. He didn't mention Blackthorn. He just pointed. The boundary is meant to be here. Rook walked the line, his gaze sweeping the ground. He moved not to the new, freshly driven oak stake, but to a spot 30 yards west, a place marked by nothing but a fist-sized knot of quartz and the withered trunk of a long-dead yucca. He crouched, sifting the soil. The government survey marker is here, Rook said, his voice as quiet as the wind. He pointed to the quartz. This is the witness stone. The yucca is the memory. He then pointed to the new blackthorn stake. That is a fence post. It sits half a hand's span west of the true line. Whoever drove it was looking at a piece of paper, not the land. Half a hand's span. It was all the proof he needed. That night, the cabin at Raven Hollow became a war room. The silence was broken by the scrape of chalk and the rustle of maps. Mara, armed with Rook's testimony, began to work. She had boiled mesquite beans to create a dark, permanent ink. Her canvas was not fine paper, but a clean stretch of burlap feed sack. She drew with a surveyor's precision, but an artist's soul. She first drew the land as Rook saw it, as the earth itself had dictated, showing the watershed, the true line of the draw following the contours of the rock. Then, on the same burlap, she overlaid the blackthorn claim in charcoal. The lines were stark, arrogant, and wrong. They cut straight across the land's natural flow, violating the logic of the terrain. It looked exactly as Rook had described it, the work of someone geographically blind, imposing a lie onto a map. They worked late, the tension a tangible thing in the small cabin. As the fire burned low, Harlan sat on the porch, cleaning his tools. He took out his hunting knife and a sharpening stone. The rhythmic shing, shing, shing of steel on stone, a familiar comfort. Mara came out and sat on the step below him, not in his space, but near it. She was holding his smaller skinning knife, the one with the loose handle. She held it out to him. He took it and began to work on that, too. The porch was cast in shadow, the only light the silver glow from the rising moon. They sat in their shared quiet. The sound of the whetstone, the only anchor. His hand, calloused and brown from the sun, moved back and forth. Her hand, small and now scarred from her work on the ranch, rested on the step beside his knee. As he turned the knife to work the other side, the back of his hand brushed against the back of hers. A jolt, like a static charge from a dry wind, passed between them. It was the first unplanned touch, an accidental intimacy that felt louder than a gunshot. His first instinct was to pull away, a violent recoil born of a decade of solitude. He froze, his hand hovering over hers. He saw her catch her breath, saw her fingers curl slightly, but she didn't move. Then, slowly, deliberately, Harlan relaxed. He let his hand settle, the rough skin of his knuckles resting against hers. It was a fragile point of contact, warm and real. He stopped sharpening. He just sat there, breathing, allowing the simple, terrifying comfort of her touch. After a long moment, he resumed his work, his hand brushing hers with every pass. No longer an accident, but a new, unspoken fact. Later, inside by the dying fire, he took the slate. He had to ask. The danger was no longer just hers, it was his. The note on his fence post proved that. "If you want to go, I'll open the gate." He wrote it clearly. It was a genuine offer. He would give her ash plume and a day's supplies, and no one would ever know. He would be giving her the freedom she had lost. Mara looked at the words, her face pale in the firelight. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the pull of survival versus this new, strange loyalty. She took the chalk, her hand trembling slightly. She erased his words. "If you are alone, I stay." Harlan read the words, and his heart, a stubborn, unused muscle, gave a painful lurch. She wasn't staying for shelter. She was staying for him. She had seen his isolation and had chosen to stand in it with him. He nodded once. The bargain between them reset. It was no longer about safety. It was about alliance. The news came 2 days later, brought by Tobin Gray on his regular route. He stopped at the hollow, his wagon loaded with banjos and accordions, his face grim. "The game is moving fast." "Harlan," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Word in Mesquite Vale is that Blackthorn is finalizing the claim. They're sending a team to set the permanent siok at Dry Needle Draw next week. Once that's done, it's legal, and there's not a thing you can do." The deadline hung in the air, heavy and final, but there was more. "And Ada Marin," Tobin continued, lowering his voice. "She was in the archives. Found something. She said to tell you the handwriting is the same, across 3 different claims, all filed by different people, all sold to Blackthorn for pennies on the dollar." So, it was a system, a conspiracy. Before Harlan could absorb this, Rook Talon appeared from the rocks above the cabin, materializing as if from the air itself. His presence confirmed the urgency. 3 men, Rook said, his voice flat. Riding from San Saba. They are not ranchers. They carry new rifles and watch the shadows. He pointed west. They are camped in Dead Coyote Cut. It's the only way to the draw from the south. They are not waiting for you. They are waiting for anyone. An ambush. They weren't just protecting the claim. They were setting a trap. The air in the cabin crackled with this new, lethal energy. They had a week. They were outnumbered. The law was against them, and the land itself was now a snare. That night, Harlan went to the loose floorboard. He retrieved the tobacco tin, the small, folded paper inside. This house was no longer safe. He went to the barn, to Ash Plume's stall. He untied the stitching on the underside of his saddle skirt, pushed the small, flat tin deep into the wool lining, and stitched it back up with steady, practiced hands. He was a man hiding his own heart, securing his only piece of tangible truth to the only other creature he trusted. The final days were spent in grim preparation. They had the truth, but Blackthorn had the guns and the law. They couldn't win a straight fight. They had to be smarter. Harlan took Mara to the deepest gully in the hollow, far from any listening ears. He brought his Winchester rifle.
You know the horse? He said, now you learn this.
He showed her how to load, how to aim, how to brace the stock against her shoulder. He did not teach her to aim at a man. He taught her to aim at a thing. He set up a tin can on a rock 50 yards away. She missed, the shot kicking up dust.
Breathe,
he commanded, his hands on her shoulders, adjusting her stance. Feel the rhythm, same as the horse. Squeeze, don't pull. She tried again. The can jumped. She was a natural. Her steadiness, her intense focus, it all translated. They spent the next 2 days practicing. He had her sever a rope holding a feed sack, break a bottle, splinter a fence post. She was not learning to be a killer. She was learning to be a tool. She was learning how to disarm, to disrupt, to save. As she reloaded the rifle, her movements becoming sure and practiced. Harlan watched her. This was no longer the frightened girl from the ferry. This was a woman preparing for war. The night folded over Dead Coyote Cut like the lid of a casket. It was a place the sun hurried through and the wind got trapped in. A narrow, rocky gash in the earth that was the only practical wagon route to Dry Needle Draw. And it was here, under the skeletal shadow of the Larkspur Trestle, that the Alliance made its move. The massive wooden railway bridge spanned the arroyo, a monument of heavy timber and iron that carried the new county line train. Harlan, Mara, Rook, and Tobin moved through the darkness like 4 distinct kinds of shadow. Rook was the most invisible, a whisper of moccasin on stone. Tobin, all nervous energy, was a flicker, his senses hummingbird quick. Harlan was a solid, slow-moving block of the night itself. And Mara, she was the still, watchful center. They had come not to fight the San Saba men, but to see, to know their enemies' habits. They were crouched in a cluster of boulders directly beneath the trestle, the massive beams soaring 60 feet above them. The air was dead, holding the day's heat. The Blackthorn wagons, loaded with the fraudulent stakes and a full crew, were camped a quarter-mile up the cut, their fires small and guarded. The 3 San Saba gunmen, however, were not with them.
They're here,
Rook whispered, his voice so low it was just a movement of the air. He pointed up, not at the trestle itself, but at the dark space between the supports. It was Tobin who caught it first. His head snapped up, his nose wrinkling. Wait, he crept forward, his light-fingered instincts on full alert. He put his head near the massive timber pylon that anchored the trestle to the canyon floor. I smell it, he breathed, his voice tight. Black powder and fresh-cut fuse, as if summoned by his words. A sound drifted down from above, a faint metallic click, click, scrape. It was the sound of a drill bit turning in dry wood. Harlan's blood went cold. He looked at the others, the realization dawning on all of them at once. The San Saba men weren't just guarding the pass, they were mining the trestle.
"The train,"
Harlan rasped.
"The county inspectors. They're due on Thursday's train to finalize the survey."
"They're not just blocking the inspectors," Tobin said, his voice shaking with a terrible excitement. "They're going to stop them. Permanently bury the whole investigation, and the train, right here in the cut." Another sound, a dull thump as a heavy object was set in place. A keg of powder. The scraping stopped. A new sound began the unspooling of the fuse line. They had seconds, minutes, at most. Harlan's mind raced. They couldn't fight 3 gunmen head-on, but they couldn't let them light that fuse. Mara touched his arm. He looked down. She was pointing at herself. Then up, at the dark web of crossbeams. She was the smallest, the lightest. She could move up there without making a sound, where a man of Harlan's size would send vibrations through the whole structure. Before he could object, she was already moving, scaling the rocky cliff face at the edge of the pylon, her small, scarred hands finding purchase in the stone where he saw none. She was like a spider, agile and silent, and in 10 seconds, she had vanished into the complex darkness of the trestle's underbelly. Harlan's heart hammered against his ribs. He was exposed, helpless, his fate in the hands of a woman he barely knew, dangling 60 feet above a bed of rock. Rook and Tobin melted back into the boulders, their rifles ready, watching the lip of the canyon. Harlan watched the trestle. He could see nothing. Above, in the world of beams and iron, Mara was moving. She crawled along a narrow, 12-inch support, the wind of the canyon floor far below her. The smell of sulfur and black powder was overpowering. She saw them, then 2 men, their backs to her, tamping the last of the powder kegs into a hollowed-out space in the main support pylon. A 3rd man stood watch, smoking a cigarette, its orange tip a tiny, malevolent star. She saw the fuse line. It was thick, coated in a damp, waxy sealant, and it snaked from the pylon back toward the canyon rim, where the man was smoking. She saw the bright copper gleam of the blasting cap, already crimped and inserted into the first keg. Her hands were shaking so hard, she had to press them against the rough timber to steady them. "Breathe. Feel the rhythm. Squeeze. Don't pull." Harlan's words. She was not shooting, but the principle was the same. She reached into her boot, where she carried the skinning knife he had sharpened. She didn't need to disarm all of it. She just needed to cut the line. She began to crawl forward, her dress catching on a splinter. She froze. The man with the cigarette looked up. "What was that?" "Nothing," the second man grunted, tamping the charge. "Rats. This whole damn bridge is full of them."
"I'm done here," said the 3rd,
his voice a low drawl.
"Let's light this candle and get back to the wagons. I want a drink."
The man with the cigarette nodded. He dropped it to the ground, crushed it under his heel, and reached into his pocket for a match. Mara had no more time. She lunged forward, not crawling, but scrambling. The man heard the sound, a distinct scrape of leather on wood. "Who's there?" he yelled. Spinning around, he saw her, a small, dark shape, a spirit of the trestle, her hand flashing with a blade. He raised his rifle. Down below, Harlan heard the shout. "Who's there?" He didn't think. He put 2 fingers to his lips and let out a long, piercing whistle, a perfect imitation of a red-tailed hawk, but it came from 50 yards down the arroyo, away from the bridge. The man on the trestle paused, his rifle half raised.
"What the hell?"
"It's just a bird, you idiot," his partner snarled. "That weren't no bird," the first man said, his eyes scanning the darkness. Harlan whistled again, louder this time, followed by the clatter of a rock he kicked loose. "It's coming from the wash," the gunman yelled. "Someone's down there, go." The 3 men forgot the fuse. They scrambled from the trestle and thundered down the embankment toward Harlan's position. firing their rifles into the shadows. "We see you," one shouted. The muzzle flashes lighting the canyon in brief. Violent strobes. As they ran, Mara's knife came down. It bit deep into the thick, waxy fuse. She didn't saw at it. She put her weight behind it. A single, clean cut. The line parted. She didn't wait to admire her work. She slithered back along the beam, her heart a trapped bird in her chest. Rook was suddenly beneath her, his arm outstretched. "Jump!" She didn't hesitate. She let go, dropping the last 10 feet into his arms. He absorbed the impact, and the two of them, along with Tobin, dove behind the same cluster of boulders as Harlan. The San Saba men realized the diversion. "It's a trick back to the bridge." One of them, in a panic, lit a match and touched it to the severed end of the fuse he held. A long, sputtering shower of sparks erupted. It fizzled and sparked. A pathetic, angry snake, lighting up the rock face and then, just as quickly, dying with a damp hiss. The main charge was inert. The bridge was safe. "Damn it!" the leader roared, his voice echoing in the cut. Find them all." But the four were already gone, retreating deeper into the maze of rocks and shadows, leaving the gunmen to rage at the darkness. They ran for a half-mile, stopping only when their lungs burned and the shouts of the gunmen were faint echoes. They collapsed in a deep, sandy ravine, hidden from the moon, the silence deafening after the chaos. Harlan leaned against the cool sand, his rifle across his knees. He was breathing hard. He looked at Mara. She was huddled, her arms around her knees, her entire body shaking in the aftermath of the terror. He reached out, his hand hovering, uncertain. He wanted to say something, to thank her, but the words wouldn't come. She looked up at him, her face a pale oval in the gloom. The shared danger, the brush with a violent end, had broken something open in her. The secrets she had guarded with her silence were now too heavy to hold. She turned to the wall of the ravine. The sand was dark and damp. She began to write, her fingers clawing at the earth, the letters large and frantic. Harlan lit a match, shielding the tiny flame with his hand. "I worked for Pike. I kept his ledgers." Harlan stared at the words. The match burned his fingers, and he dropped it, plunging them back into darkness. He lit another. He understood. The ledgers at the ferry, the stolen funds. It was all true. "I took one," she wrote, a small one. He looked at her, and his face, in the tiny, flickering light, was not angry. It was not judgmental. It was just intensely, profoundly still. He knelt beside her. The match was dying. He took the chalk from his own pocket and pressed it into her hand. Then he lit a third match. Why, he wrote on a flat stone. She took the chalk, her hand shaking so hard the letters were almost illegible. She wrote on the stone, beneath his word. "He took my mother's land. He used false papers, a forged signature. She died with nothing. He took it all." The words hung in the air, stark and brittle, like dried blood. This wasn't about principle. This wasn't about the law. This was about revenge. The same cold, personal fury that had driven him to hide the note in his saddle was what had driven her to steal the ledger. He finally understood her. As if in another world. The scene cut to Mesquite Vale. Miss Ada Marin sat at her desk in the empty schoolhouse, a single lamp burning. In front of her was the tattered, water-stained book Mara had given her, the ledger she had carried in her gray satchel. It was mostly numbers, dry and meaningless. But Ada had her own books. She had the county's tax rolls and the church's donation lists, which Temperance Pike had so proudly published. She dipped her pen in the ink, her brow furrowed. She was comparing dates. It was a hunch, a teacher's instinct for a pattern, and she found it. January 12th, a special church collection fee of $50 recorded. January 12th, the deed for the Miller Ranch filed as delinquent, bought by Blackthorn Co-op. February 3rd, a church roofing fund donation of $75. February 3rd, The Harrison family's water rights claim legally voided. Again and again, the dates matched. The money Temperance Pike was collecting as charity was a slush fund, a flow of cash that perfectly coincided with the dates of her husband's most predatory acquisitions. It was the bribe money. It was the system. Ada leaned back, the blood draining from her face. She now held the financial key to the entire Blackthorn conspiracy. Back in the ravine, the last match died. Harlan sat in the darkness, the truth of Mara's confession settling over him. He understood her silence, her watchfulness, her desperate courage. He understood the hawk-like gaze he had seen at the ferry. It was the look of a person who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. He reached out in the dark, his hand finding hers. She flinched, then went still. He didn't squeeze her hand. He simply laid his, calloused and warm, over the back of hers, covering her knuckles. It was not a gesture of comfort. It was a gesture of allegiance, a quiet, physical, I know, a wordless vow that her fight was now his. They sat there for a long time, two silent figures in a dark ravine, and then, from far away, cutting through the night, came a long, lonely sound, the whistle of the Thursday train, still miles out, running on schedule, steaming unknowingly toward a bridge that, but for them, would have been its grave. The sound was a summons. The time for hiding in the shadows was over. The plan to stop Blackthorn had to change. It had to become as loud and as public as that oncoming train. The failure at the Larkspur trestle was a spark thrown on dry powder. The Blackthorn Syndicate, with Temperance Pike now its cold, calculating mind, could no longer wait for the county inspectors. They had to discredit the evidence before it was ever presented, and that evidence had two hearts, the schoolteacher and the rancher. Marshal Deke Rowley did not bother knocking. He kicked the schoolhouse door open, the wood slamming against the interior wall with a crack that made the children jump. Miss Ada Marin, who had been pointing to a map of the United States, spun around, her hand flying to her throat. "Aye, Marshal, there are children present." "Get 'em out," Rowley snarled, his eyes sweeping the small, orderly room. He was not the polite, smirking vulture of a week ago. This was a cornered animal. "I've got a warrant to search these premises for stolen property." Stolen. Ada stood her ground, though her knees were shaking. "This is a school." "It's a den for a thief," Rowley said, advancing on her desk. He swept a stack of copybooks to the floor. "Where is it? Miss Marin, where is that tattered ledger? The one you're holding for that thieving little bookkeeper?" The children, pale and terrified, scrambled for the door. Ada watched them go, her face a mask of pale fury. "You have no right." "I have every right," Rowley said, yanking a drawer open, dumping its contents. "Interfering with the recovery of the church's stolen charity funds. That's a serious offense. Aiding a fugitive. Lying to a federal officer? I can see you run out of this county. Miss Marin, you'll be teaching in a tent in the mudflats. If you're lucky. Now. Where is it?" He tore the room apart. A whirlwind of petty destruction, upending her desk, ripping her careful maps from the wall. He found nothing. The ledger was safe, but the message had been delivered. As he stormed out, he paused at the door. "You're done here, teacher. Consider your contract void." The next target was Harlan. They came for him at dusk. Not at the cabin, but in the open pasture, where he was mending the fence that bordered Dry Needle Draw. Rowley was there, along with two deputies Harlan had never seen before, men with the hard, dull eyes of hired muscle. "Harlan Quaid," Rowley called out, his voice carrying on the wind. "By the authority of Mesquiteville County, you're under arrest." Harlan slowly straightened, the fencing tool heavy in his hand. He had known this was coming. He just hadn't known when. From the high rocks above the hollow, he saw a flicker of movement. Mara, watching, a helpless shadow. He had told her to run to the high ground if she ever saw riders. Arrest for what? Harlan's voice was a low rumble. Harboring a fugitive, aiding in the theft of public documents, lying to an officer of the law, conspiring to defraud the Blackthorn Cooperative and the Holy Church. That last part was Temperance's masterstroke. This was not just a legal matter. It was a moral one. Harlan looked at the deputies, their hands hovering over their sidearms. He let the fencing tool drop to the dirt. He would not give them the satisfaction of a fight. They swarmed him, yanking his arms behind his back, the rope biting deep into his wrists. They shoved him toward his own horse, and as they rode past the cabin, one of the deputies lit a torch and tossed it onto the porch. The small bundles of herbs Mara had hung there, the yarrow and sage curled and smoked. A bitter, cleansing scent that was immediately swallowed by the acrid smell of burning pine. They didn't take him to the jail. They took him to the center of town, to the dilapidated donkey shed behind the church, a place of public humiliation. They hauled him from Ash Plume and shoved him inside, the smell of old straw and animal musk filling his nostrils. They tied him to the central support beam, his hands bound tight. And then they left him. The townsfolk, drawn by the commotion, gathered at the open doorway. Not a lynch mob, not yet, but a crowd of anemic, fearful accusers. "Just give her up, Harlan," someone called, his voice thin in the growing darkness.
"It's that girl. She brought this,"
a woman cried.
"She stole from the church fund."
He set the mill fire. "Think of your land, Quaid." He stood silent, his head bowed, enduring the barrage of their fear. He was what they had always suspected him to be, a stranger, an outsider. His solitude was now his crime. He had chosen to stand apart from them, and now they were using that very isolation to break him. They believed that a man so thoroughly alone must, eventually, snap. Then the sky broke. The storm that had been threatening for days arrived in a single, violent rush. A crack of thunder, so loud it felt like the earth splitting, was followed by a deluge. The wind howled, and the rain came down in solid, horizontal sheets. The tin roof of the shed became a deafening drum, a hollow percussion that drowned out the voices of the crowd. They scattered, running for their homes, abandoning him to the judgment of the storm. He was left in the roaring dark, the wind and rain lashing him through the open doorway. He hung against the ropes, the cold seeping into his bones. This was the dark pit. This was the end of the line. An hour passed, or maybe it was an eternity. The door, which had been banging on its hinges, creaked open and was pushed shut, muffling the storm's roar to a dull thunder. A light flared, a storm lantern, its flame steady and gold, casting wild shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Mara stood before him, the lantern held high. She was soaked to the skin, her dark hair plastered to her face and neck, her dress clinging to her small, shivering frame. She set the lantern on a bale of hay and moved to him without a word. Her face was a pale, serious mask of determination. He watched as she reached up, her fingers fumbling with the wet mass of her hair. She pulled a thin, dark object from the knot she had tied at the nape of her neck. It was the skinning knife, the one he had sharpened. She moved behind him. He felt the tension of the blade, the sawing motion, and then the blessed release as the first rope fell away from his wrists. She moved to the front, cutting the ropes that bound his chest to the beam. He stumbled forward, his arms numb, and caught himself against the post, rubbing his raw wrists. He looked at her, truly looked at her. In the golden lantern light, she was trembling, a fine, uncontrollable shiver that shook her entire body. She was not just wet, she was frozen, her lips a pale blue. "You're cold," he rasped, the first words he had spoken in hours. She just looked at him, her eyes wide and dark, reflecting the small, steady flame. They were trapped. The town was hostile. The storm was a cage. There was nowhere to run. She took a single, shuddering step forward. She let the knife fall to the straw floor. Then, in a movement so simple and so profound it stopped his heart, she pressed her forehead against his chest, against the rough, damp wool of his shirt. He could feel the violent tremor of her shivering. He was cold, too, but his large frame held a deeper heat. Instinct, an instinct older than loneliness, took over. He raised his arms and wrapped them around her, pulling her small, trembling body against his. She burrowed into him, and he could feel her desperation. She was not seeking comfort. She was seeking an anchor in the middle of the deluge. She tilted her head back, her wet face upturned to his, her forehead pressed against his, skin to skin. It was a gesture of utter, desperate intimacy. He could feel her breath, a small, cold puff against his lips. Her hands, impossibly cold, came up to circle his neck. Her fingers were like ice, but they gripped the back of his head, in his wet hair, with a survivor's strength. Her body was taut as a bowstring. He lowered his head. His own breath hitched. He moved slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. He pressed his lips to her cheek, tasting the salt of the rain and the cold of her skin. She didn't move. She just watched him, her eyes luminous. He moved his mouth, just barely, to the corner of hers. He paused there, a breath away, a silent question. Her response was her own. She let out a small, broken sound, a sigh or a sob, and lifted her face. Closing the last fraction of an inch, her cold lips met his. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was desperate and clumsy. A raw, unspoken need. It was the first warmth they had either of them felt, a small, shared heat in a world that had gone utterly cold. His hands, which had been resting on her shoulders, slid down her back, spreading wide, pulling her even closer. He was not trying to possess her. He was trying to warm her, to pour his own life, his own heat, into her. He felt her body, rigid with cold and fear, finally, begin to yield. Her shivering didn't stop, but it synced with his, their bodies moving in the same desperate, trembling rhythm. It was a language without words, a physical vow. I am here. Stay. He pulled back, just enough to speak. His forehead remained pressed against hers. He looked into her bright, wet eyes. His voice was a low rasp, barely louder than the drumming rain on the roof. "If you say, 'Don't let this end,'" he whispered, his own words a promise he had no right to make, "I'll stop the storm itself." A single tear tracked from the corner of her eye, hot against her cold skin. She nodded, just once. A tiny, convulsive movement. It was all the answer he needed. The sound of a horse whinnying in the street, sharp with fear of the storm, broke the spell. Rowley. They wouldn't stay gone for long. "We have to move," he said. He released her, and the cold rushed back in. A physical blow. "The plan. It's now." They parted in the lashing rain, two shadows slipping out the back of the shed. He held the burlap map, now wrapped in oilcloth. She clutched the precious ledger to her chest. "The trough," she whispered, her voice raw. 3 knocks. He nodded. Rowley found the empty shed a minute later. The cut ropes a coiled snake in the straw. They're gone, heading for the cut after them. He led his soaked posse on a fool's errand. Thundering out of town toward the canyon, following the tracks Mara had painstakingly laid hours before. But she was not with them. She slipped through the alleyways, a ghost in the storm, while Rook, his form one with the downpour, met Harlan at the edge of town. Together, they cleared the path back to Raven Hollow, using the storm as their shield. And as the town was torn between the hunt and the hurricane, Tobin Gray, carrying a simple canvas satchel, picked the lock on the Blackthorn Co-op's back office. The building was empty. The safe, Temperance's new pride, sat against the wall. Tobin's fingers worked with the delicate precision of a surgeon. A click, a whir. The heavy door swung open. He did not take the money. He took the forged ledgers, the stacks of false deeds, And in their place, he unfolded a single, massive object. He shoved it into the safe, a heavy, dark green canvas, sticky with pine resin and smelling of smoke. He closed the heavy door, spun the dial, and slipped back out into the storm. The darkness had swallowed the town. The counterattack, fueled by a single desperate kiss in a cold shed, had begun. The storm broke at dawn, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet sage and ozone. But the tempest that had swept through the town's soul was only just beginning to gather force. The plan, forged in whispers and sealed by a desperate kiss, now moved into the unforgiving light of day. It began not with a gunshot, but with the ringing of the schoolhouse bell. It was Ada Marin who rang it, a steady, insistent summons that was not for her students. One by one, then in pairs and small groups, the parents began to arrive. They found her standing on the schoolhouse steps, her spectacles clean, her spine straight, the wreckage of her classroom visible behind her. She was no longer just a teacher. She was the custodian of their children's future, a future that was being stolen acre by stolen acre. "They came for me yesterday," Ada began, her voice clear and steady, carrying in the clean morning air. "Marshall Rowley, acting on behalf of Mrs. Pike, accused me of holding stolen property. They tore this room apart." She gestured behind her. "They threatened my position, my name, but they were not looking for a ledger. They were looking to silence a sum. They were trying to erase a truth." She held up a single, crisp piece of paper. "A deed. This is the original survey for the Harrison homestead. It is marked by a witness stone and the watershed line. Their names are on this paper." She then held up a newer, flimsier document. "And this is the Blackthorn Co-op's filing. The Harrison name has been erased. The line has been redrawn. Your names," she said, her gaze sweeping across the anxious faces. "Your names are being erased on paper. But the rocks do not lie. The water does not lie." A low murmur went through the crowd. This was not a rumor from the saloon. This was Miss Marin, who taught their children that 2 + 2 always, unfailingly, equaled 4. As if on cue, Rook Talon stepped forward from the side of the building. He held no paper. His evidence was the earth itself. "Come," he said, his voice quiet but resonant. "I will show you the lies." He led them, a straggling, uncertain procession of farmers and ranchers, out to the disputed lands. He didn't lecture. He simply walked them to the boundary of the Miller Ranch. "Here," he said, pointing to a shallow depression and a gnarled old mesquite root, the original marker. Then he pointed 50 yards east to a new, raw stake bearing the Blackthorn brand, the new one. He did it again at the Harrison plot and again at the edge of Dry Needle Draw. Each time, the theft was plain, arrogant, and undeniable. The ranchers, men who knew their land like the backs of their own hands, stared at the stolen ground, their faces hardening from confusion to a slow, cold anger. At the final stop, Mara stepped forward. She did not speak. She unrolled the burlap map, its mesquite ink lines dark and true. She laid it on the ground, weighting the corners with stones. The map showed the land as it was, the true lines following the logic of the earth, in stark charcoal, overlaid like a scar. Was the Blackthorn claim a grid of straight, false lines? The assembled landowners gathered around, their silence a testament to the map's shocking clarity. Mara looked up, her gaze meeting theirs, one by one. She opened her mouth as if to speak, to explain the numbers, the fraud, the reason for her flight. But no words came. The story was too large, too full of pain and fear. Instead, she did the only thing she could. She pressed her hand flat against her heart. Here, it was a gesture of pure, unassailable truth. And in the profound, respectful silence that followed, the town finally began to choose a side. Miles away, another part of the symphony was reaching its crescendo. Harlan Quaid was in the saddle, a lone rider against a vast landscape, but he was not alone. He was driving his herd, 100 head of longhorn cattle, a river of horn and hide, moving them from the high pastures of Raven Hollow in a long, sweeping arc. He was not driving them to market. He was driving them toward River Finch Crossing, a wide, shallow ford on the only road the Blackthorn wagons could take back to town. The air was thick with dust and the lowing of the cattle, a sound like rolling thunder. Ash Plume moved under him, a living part of his will, his powerful muscles responding to the slightest pressure of Harlan's knees. On a low rise overlooking a shortcut the wagons would surely take, Tobin Gray worked quickly. He wasn't setting a trap for men, he was setting one for paper. He stretched a thin, high-tensile steel wire, the kind used for a piano's high C, between two sturdy yucca plants, no more than a foot off the ground. It was nearly invisible. It wouldn't stop a wagon. It wouldn't harm a horse. But it was just high enough to catch the bottom of a poorly secured box on the wagon's undercarriage. Back at the schoolhouse, the confrontation came to a head. Marshal Rowley arrived, his face flushed with anger. "That's enough." "Marin," he shouted, pushing through the crowd, "you're under arrest for inciting a public panic." He reached for her arm, but he never touched her. The parents, who had been a loose crowd, now formed a solid, silent line. They stood shoulder to shoulder, blocking the steps, their faces grim. They were not armed. They did not need to be. They were a wall of simple, parental conviction. A fine carriage pulled up then, and Temperance Pike stepped out, dressed in immaculate gray. She surveyed the scene with a thin, condescending smile. "Really, Ada," she said, her voice dripping with false pity. "To what desperate lengths you will go. You have no proof, only the ramblings of a known thief." She held up a document with a flourish. It was embossed with a golden seal. "This is a certificate from the church, attesting to the funds that girl stole. It is signed by the circuit reverend himself. What do you have to counter that?" Ada reached into her satchel and produced the original deed she had shown the crowd earlier. "I have this," she said calmly, "and I have its watermark." She held the paper up to the sun. A faint, intricate pattern of a loom was visible within the fibers. The county's official paper. "From the mill in San Antonio." She then pointed at Temperance's certificate. "Yours has no such mark. It is fine paper, Mrs. Pike, but it is not the truth. It is a forgery." Temperance's smile faltered. The crowd murmured, the tide of their opinion turning into a palpable wave. At that moment, from her vantage point on the hill, Mara heard it, the rumble of heavy wagons, the jingle of harnesses, the Blackthorn crew. Their work at the draw finished, were coming back. It was time. She ran to the old iron water trough at the edge of the schoolyard. She picked up a stone and struck it 3 times. Clang, clang, clang. The signal. The first note of the finale. The sound carried on the clear air, reaching Harlan where he held the herd, a churning sea of cattle. On the rise above Finch Crossing, he heard it. He raised his head, and from deep in his chest, he let out a single, booming cry, a sound more animal than human, a command the herd understood in its collective soul. He spurred Ash Plume, driving hard into the flank of the lead steer. The herd, startled and compressed, turned. The river of cattle surged, not across the road, but down it, a thundering, unstoppable wave of horns and hooves, straight toward the approaching Blackthorn wagons. The wagon drivers saw it coming. They panicked. They couldn't go forward. They hauled on the reins, trying to turn their heavy wagons in the narrow road, their shouts lost in the cacophony. The only way to go was back toward the soft, sandy banks of Finch Crossing. The lead wagon, turning too sharply, tilted. A heavy, iron-strapped strongbox, the one Tobin had predicted, slid on its mounts, hit the steel wire he had set, and tumbled from the wagon's undercarriage. It landed in the dirt with a heavy, metallic crunch. The lock, strained by the impact, burst. The lid flew open. A blizzard of papers flew out, scattered by the wind from the stampede. But one book, a thick, leather-bound ledger, fell out and landed open. A gust of wind riffled its pages, and then it lay still. The townsfolk, drawn by the thunder of the herd, had arrived from Rook's tour. They stood on the banks, watching in stunned silence. The dust began to settle. In the sudden quiet, they could all see the open ledger. They saw the neat columns of numbers, and on the top of the page, in a clear, precise hand, was the title of the column that listed payments to Marshal Deke Rowley. It did not say fees or expenses. It said God's grief fee. A collective gasp went through the crowd. For a moment, there was absolute silence, the kind of silence that precedes an earthquake. And then, it broke. A woman cried out, "Oh, my lord!" A man swore, a low, vicious sound. "I knew it!" another voice said, trembling with rage. The silence did not just end. It exploded. The God's grief fee hung in the air, suspended in the sudden, terrible silence. The dust from the stampede began a slow, golden descent, turning the air at Finch Crossing into a kind of cathedral of light, illuminating the open ledger like an indictment on an altar. That silence was the breaking point. It was the moment the pressure became too much, and the first crack appeared in the blackthorn facade. It came from Slade, the lead San Saba gunman, who had been riding guard on the lead wagon. He saw the ledger. He saw the faces of the townsfolk, their stunned silence turning to a low, animal growl. He saw his payday, his power, and his freedom dissolving in the afternoon sun. He did the only thing a man like him knew how to do. He went for his gun. His hand clawed at his holster, the black metal of the pistol clearing the leather. "Back!" he roared. "All of you, back!" Across the crossing, Marshal Deke Rowley, who had been sitting frozen on his horse, saw Slade's move. Rowley's gaze flicked from the gun to the incriminating ledger, to the wall of enraged ranchers, and then, finally, to the small, determined faces of the school children, who had followed the crowd and now stood watching from the fence line. In that fractional second, Rowley made a calculation. He didn't draw his own weapon. He didn't move to help Slade. He took one half-step back, his horse shifting nervously, his hands visibly, deliberately, moving away from his own holster. He was choosing a side, the one that was left standing. The standoff was broken not by a bullet, but by the sharp thwack of a rifle shot from the ridge above. It wasn't aimed at Slade, it was aimed at the wagon. High on the main wagon's canvas cover, a large, arrogant banner emblazoned with the Blackthorn Co-op logo flapped in the breeze. Rook's shot, fired from an impossible distance, struck not the sign, but the rope that held it. The heavy, painted canvas, suddenly freed, collapsed. It fell forward like a shroud, a wave of dark fabric that engulfed the wagon's driver and the two guards beside him. The horses, already panicked by the cattle, screamed as the canvas monster fell over them. It was chaos. Men shouted, tangled in the heavy cloth, their forms struggling underneath like trapped birds. Temperance Pike, standing near her fine carriage, watched her empire literally collapse, her face, a mask of cold porcelain, finally cracked, her eyes burning with a cold, venomous fury. Bypast the wagons, the crowd, and the marshal. They found Mara, standing on the muddy bank, her hand still pressed to her heart, the author of this ruin. It was too much. The carefully constructed artifice of the grieving, charitable widow dissolved into raw, primal hatred. "You!" Temperance shrieked, the sound tearing from her throat, raw and ugly. She lunged, not with a gun, but with her hands clawed. A desperate physical attack aimed at the girl who had taken everything. Mara, frozen by the sudden, direct assault, had no time to react, but Harlan did. He was already moving. Ash Plume, sensing his rider's intent, bounded forward, crossing the space between them in two powerful leaps. Harlan didn't draw his rifle. He didn't strike. He simply interposed himself, a solid wall of man and horse. The roan's powerful shoulder came between the two women, a shield of living muscle. Temperance, blind with rage, slammed into the horse's flank. She staggered back, her fine gray dress spattered with mud, her hair knocked from its perfect coil, her mask of civility utterly gone. The chaos was absolute. The wagon team, blind under the canvas and spooked by Harlan's sudden movement, surged backward, the heavy wagon wheels, already on the soft bank, lost their purchase. With a groan of tortured wood, the two lead blackthorn wagons slid, tilted, and then crashed down the embankment into the shallow, churning water of Finch Crossing. The impact was a hollow thump that sent a spray of muddy water high into the air, glittering like knives in the sun. Mara, trying to scramble out of the path of the sliding wagon, slipped on the wet, treacherous sand of the riverbank. She fell hard, landing on her hands and knees in the muck, just feet from the chaos. From the saddle, Harlan leaned down, his arm outstretched. He didn't shout. He didn't command. His voice was a low, urgent rumble. "Mara." She looked up, her face streaked with mud, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with a wild, bright fire, a conflagration of adrenaline and unshed tears. She saw his hand, his calloused, steady hand, reaching for her. She took it. He didn't just pull, he lifted, in one fluid, powerful motion that spoke of a lifetime of leverage and labor. Harlan Quaid drew her up from the mud. He gathered her in, pulling her across his lap and settling her in front of him, shielded by his own body. She was light, soaked, and trembling, not from cold, but from the sheer, violent release of the moment. She was safe, enclosed in the circle of his arms, surrounded by the smell of his horse, his worn leather, and the solid, steady warmth of his body. The roar of the cattle, the shouts of the crowd, the crash of the wagons, it all seemed to fall away, muffled, distant. There was only the creak of the saddle leather and the sound of their breathing. She turned her head, her cheek pressing against the rough wool of his duster. She looked up at his face, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the chaos they had wrought. Her voice was a whisper, a ragged breath that was meant for him alone, a plea against the ending of this moment, this fight, this impossible, terrifying connection. "Don't let this end, please," she said, her lips barely moving, her voice cracking with the weight of it all. As the lonely rancher gathered her in the saddle's hush, Harlan's arm, which had been around her waist, tightened. It was an answer, a promise. He held her secure with one arm, his hand still holding hers, their fingers laced together on the saddle horn. He looked past her, his gaze locking onto Slade. The gunman was untangling himself, his pistol still in his hand, his eyes wild. Harlan didn't spur Ash Plume. He just squeezed with his knees. The great roan, trained to a breath, pivoted on his hind legs, a dancer in the chaos. He didn't charge. He herded. He moved toward Slade, not as a threat, but as an obstacle, a force of nature. Slade, his attention divided, stumbled backward, trying to keep his footing in the muck and aim at the same time. He backed away from the horse, his boots sinking deep. He took one step too many, and his heel caught on the thin, invisible steel wire that Tobin had strung between the yuccas. It was not a violent impact. It was a perfect, ignominious trip. Slade's feet went out from under him, his arms flailing. He landed flat on his back in the mud, and the pistol flew from his grasp, landing with a wet thwup in the sand. Useless. From the bank, Ada Marin saw her opening. She was not a fighter, but she was a purveyor of truth. She ran forward, clutching the bundle of original, watermarked deeds. She didn't go to the marshal. She went to the people. She scrambled onto the chassis of the overturned wagon and threw the deeds, one by one, out to the crowd. "Here," she cried, her voice ringing with a teacher's authority. "Here is the Harrison deed.
Here is the Miller deed. Here is the truth.
The papers were passed from hand to hand, a current of electricity moving through the crowd. Men and women saw their own names, their neighbors' names, written in old, faded ink on paper they recognized. They saw the true lines, the witness stones. The paper was passed like a torch, from rancher to farmer to parent, and with every hand that touched it, the cold anger solidified into an unbreakable resolve. Marshal Deke Rowley saw it all. He saw Slade disarmed. He saw Temperance, a ruined, muddy figure, weeping in rage. He saw the ledger lying open in the sand. He saw the deeds being passed through the crowd like scripture. And he saw the children, his town's children, watching him from the schoolyard fence, their faces silent, their eyes clear and judging. There was no exit. There was no more calculation. He slowly, deliberately, unbuckled his gun belt. He let it fall. All of it. The pistol, the badge, the symbol of his bought and paid for authority, into the mud at his horse's feet. He raised his hands, palms open, in the universal sign of surrender. It was over. Two ranchers, their faces grim, moved to the sputtering, mud-caked Slade. They didn't hit him. They took the coil of new, waxed staking rope from the wagon, the very rope intended to steal their land, and used it to bind his hands. Temperance Pike was left alone. No one approached her. No one offered her a hand. She had built her empire on the pretense of charity and grace, and now, covered in mud, her public mask destroyed, she had nothing left. She sank to her knees, a statue of black silk and gray mud, and let out a single, dry sob that was swallowed by the wind. The great herd of cattle, their purpose served, was already moving off, a low wave of thunder fading into the distance. The dust, which had been a golden, chaotic cloud, began to settle, drifting down in the late afternoon light. A sound rose from the crowd. It was not a cheer. It was not a shout of victory. It was a single, collective exhalation. 100 people, who had been holding their breath for a year, finally letting it go. It was the sound of a fever breaking. It was the sound of release. The world did not erupt in cheers. The dust settled, the cattle moved on, and the silence that fell over Finch Crossing was deeper and more profound than any that had come before. In the center of it all, an island in the stream of quiet consequence. Harlan and Mara remained on the back of Ash Plume. The chaos had been a storm around them. But here, in the circle of his arms, there was an almost impossible stillness. She was still pressed against him, the tremors of the fight slowly leaving her body, replaced by a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. His hand was still clasped over hers on the worn, polished saddle horn, and she could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her back, a rhythm that was becoming as familiar as her own. Beneath their joined hands, she felt the answering thrum of her own pulse. It was the same beat, one heart, one rhythm, in the quiet hush of the saddle. It was Ada Marin who gave voice to the silence. She stood on the broken chassis of the overturned wagon, not as a teacher, but as the town's conscience. Her voice, usually reserved for lessons on arithmetic and history, was now imbued with the weight of both. She held one of the true deeds aloft, the setting sun making the watermark glow.
"This deed," she declared, her voice ringing with an authority no one dared question, "restores the land of the Harrison family to its rightful owners. And this one," she picked up another, "returns the Miller Ranch to the Miller family." She continued, reading the names, each one a nail being driven into the coffin of the Blackthorn Co-op. When she was done, she looked directly at the circle of stunned, silent men who had ridden with the wagons, and finally, at the muddy, defeated form of Temperance Pike. By the evidence of these deeds, and the clear testimony of the land itself, the Blackthorn Cooperative is guilty of systemic fraud, theft, and conspiracy against the people of this county. The verdict was delivered, not by a judge in a black robe,
but by a schoolteacher in a dusty skirt, and it was no less binding. As if her words were a signal, a slow, deliberate sound began. It was the sound of work, of restoration. Rook Talon had walked to the first of the false stakes, the arrogant oaken post that had marked the theft of the miller's pasture. With a single, powerful pull, he tore it from the earth and cast it aside. He then walked to the place he had shown them earlier, the place marked by the witness stone and the memory of a dead yucca. From a leather satchel, he produced a new stake, not of raw oak, but of weathered, seasoned cedar. He placed its point on the true mark and drew a heavy wooden mallet from his belt. Thump! The sound was not loud, but it echoed in the profound quiet. It was a sound of finality. Thump! It was the sound of a nail being driven, a gavel falling, a bell tolling. Thump! With each deliberate strike, he drove the marker back into its rightful place, correcting a lie with the simple truth of wood and earth. When he was finished, he moved to the next boundary, and the sound began again. A slow, steady heartbeat of justice being hammered back into the wounded land. From the edge of the crowd, Tobin Gray watched, a thin smile on his lips. He had done his work in the shadows of the storm. He had seen the empty safe, its contents now evidence in Ada's hands. He had placed the incriminating resin-stained tarp inside. He knew what Rowley and Temperance would find when they returned to their empty fortress, not stolen cash, but the proof of their own arson. He reached over to the overturned wagon and knocked 3 times on its iron-rimmed wheel. Knock, knock, knock. It was his signal. The curtain was down. The show was over. The crowd, which had been a single, angry mass, began to part. They moved aside, creating a wide, clear path that led from the chaos of Finch Crossing, up the bank, and onto the long, straight road to the county courthouse in Mesquite Vale. It was a silent, communal gesture. They were not a mob, they were a jury, and they were clearing the way for the guilty. The 2 ranchers who had bound Slade pulled him to his feet. They did the same for the other Blackthorn men, who offered no resistance. Lastly, they approached the former Marshal Deke Rowley. He did not look at them. He just walked, his head bowed, to the front of the procession. The long walk had begun. On the back of Ash Plume, Mara felt the shift in the world around her. The fight was over. The future, a terrifying, blank page just an hour before, was now something that could be written. She leaned into Harlan, a gesture of complete, exhausted trust. She rested her forehead against his temple, against the rough, sun-warmed skin. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of him, a mixture of dust, leather, and the clean sweat of righteous labor. He turned his head slightly, and his lips brushed against her forehead. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of the storm shed. This was something else. It was light, a mere whisper of pressure. Yet it was as firm and binding as a vow. It was a seal, a promise, a statement of fact. He leaned down, his own lips close to her ear, but he didn't speak the words aloud. He moved his mouth so she could read them, a private message in the midst of the public resolution. "Home isn't a place," he whispered. The words a vibration she felt more than heard. "It's a person." She opened her eyes. She did not speak. She simply nodded. A single, profound affirmation. Her hand, still clasped in his, tightened its grip on the saddle horn, their fingers interlaced, becoming one. It was their new anchor, their new boundary stake. At the edge of Finch Crossing, the procession of the guilty began its slow march toward town. Slade, Temperance, Rowley, and the others were herded along, not by guns, but by the silent, watching eyes of the people they had tried to defraud. The land itself seemed to be the final judge, its quiet, unyielding presence, the verdict etched in stone. The afternoon light was failing, turning the dust still hanging in the air into a haze of brilliant gold. Harlan didn't urge Ash Plume forward. He just let him stand, a silent, powerful witness, the great roan. As if sensing the gravity of the moment, shifted his weight and lifted a single foreleg, his hoof hovering an inch above the sacred, reclaimed ground. In that frozen moment, as the dust swirled around them like a benediction, Harlan and Mara turned to each other. Their eyes met, and in that shared gaze was the entire story. The fear, the fight, the storm, the fire, the quiet moments of shared work, and the impossible, undeniable truth that had grown between them. He lowered his head, and she lifted her face to his. Their lips, no longer driven by desperation but by a slow, dawning certainty, moved to meet. And just as they were about to touch, from miles away, from the steeple in Mesquite Vale, a single, clear sound rang out across the prairie, the courthouse bell, tolling the end of the day, tolling the beginning of justice. The image freezes, the two faces, inches apart, the golden light, the sound of the bell hanging in the air as the world slowly, finally, fades to black, leaving only the whisper of the wind and the unspoken promise felt by everyone watching our story. Continues. Thank you so much for listening to our tale. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to give it an extra boost, hit that hype button to help this story be heard by more people.